In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains the order and chaos in our lives.
Okay, so the first hypothesis we're going to entertain is the idea that you have to frame the world in order to interact with it. And this is sort of a little mythological diagram that I whipped up a long time ago. And the bottom thing, that's an Ouroboros, by the way, which is a dragon that eats its own tail. It's an ancient symbol of chaos. And chaos is what you see when you don't know what you're looking at. And so you could say, in some sense, chaos is all the complexity that surrounds you that could possibly intrude on your little safe world. And then to grasp that chaos or to operate within it, you have to put it within a framework. And so that's the great father there. That's actually God. You see, and God's got the sun behind him because God is like the sun. He's, reliable, and he's associated with consciousness, and then he's sort of ruling over this city. And so for me, that was a good symbol of culture. And in part, culture is what's outside of you. But in part, culture is also the frameworks that you've learned to use by being with other people. The frameworks that you've learned to use to narrow and specify the world. And in my mode of thinking, the framing is associated with security on the one hand, because it tells you what you can do and, makes things safe for you, and tyranny on the other hand, because it can get out of control and, it can start to get too rigid. Whatever. Regardless of the pros and cons of framing, if you see something one way, then you can't see it another. It's harder to see it another. So that's the con side of framing. The pro side of framing is, well, then you get to do something. If it's unframed, you're in chaos. It's existential anxiety. You're not going to move ahead at all. So you have to frame things. You have to simplify them. And really, in some sense, you even have to oversimplify them. It depends on what you mean by that. But what you're really trying to do is to never make your perceptual task any more complex than it has to be in order to get done what you need to get done. So, how do you frame things? Well, the first thing we should point out is that a lot of framing doesn't even happen psychologically. Right? So here you are sitting in this classroom and you're not overwhelmed by chaos. Well, why? Well, first of all, you're in a city. That's helpful. There's electricity here and there's natural gas and there's people to fix all the plumbing. And so the fact that you're in a city makes life much simpler right off the bat. There's nothing trying to eat you. You don't have to contend with the fact that it's like -20 for 3 months. And, so that's a whole bunch of complexity that the civilized world has just taken care of for you. And then, now you're in the university in the city and that eliminates a whole bunch of other hassles, There's some things you have to do, but there's a bunch of things you don't have to do. And then you're inside this building and, well, look at that. There's electric light here and, and the chairs work and there's not going to be an earthquake and probably the whole building isn't going to fall down. So, by the time you're sitting in your chair here, also with your clothing on, you've screened a lot of complexity out already. And so you can sit there fairly calmly. And so that's all external. Now, part of the reason, and this is worth thinking about because this isn't only psychological. You guys will hear a fair bit about terror management theories as you progress through your education. And so terror management theories are theories that attempt to account for why people are, say, patriotic in their beliefs, why they adopt belief systems. And the idea is that a belief system protects you from death anxiety. And so Freud sort of said that about religious systems. That was his critique of religion. People are afraid of death, and so they have this infantile desire to have that fear go away, so they turn to religion, and religion says, well, death isn't permanent, and that's why people are religious. And the extension of that is, well, that's also why they have belief systems in general. They're trying to protect themselves against this deep, shaking anxiety. And to some degree, I suspect that's true. But you should also remember that when you're protecting your culture, say, if you identify with it, you're patriotic or whatever it is, or you think that your culture is worth defending, you're not just defending something psychological. It's like the culture, the functioning culture keeps the lights on. So it doesn't just protect you from death anxiety. It also protects you from death. And that's even more important most of the time than being protected from death anxiety. Now, there's a psychological component to it too, but you don't ever want to underestimate just the practical utility of being nested inside, what Piaget would consider a relatively functional game. It's like, your world's a lot simpler. You have to work to maintain it and everything, and that's kind of a drag, maybe. That's the tyrannical element of it, but, the payoff's pretty big. Okay, so if you look at medieval cities, this is a well-preserved medieval city in France. There's a lot of medieval cities that still exist in Europe. And you see, this is a typical sort of human habitation. It's like inside there's order, and outside there's chaos and barbarians, and then there's a couple of walls to keep the chaos and the barbarians out, and then inside, you know, there's a dominance hierarchy and everybody can live their relatively productive and relatively peaceful lives inside of that. It's all framing, getting rid of complexity, unnecessary complexity. Same thing with houses, they do the same thing for you. And then social institutions do the same thing too. It's like, okay, this is it Kennedy there and Obama? I think so. This is part of the transition in power from George Bush to Obama. And, you know, that's a pretty scary thing to have the leader of your dominance hierarchy replaced by another leader. And, you know, among chimpanzees, for example, that's often the occasion for a fair bit of mayhem. And it's also the case often for people that occurs. And, you know, we still have that in the form of political corruption and so on. But all things considered, you know, the power transition from Obama, or from Bush to Obama, was far more peaceful than such power transitions generally are if you look across the history of mankind. And so that means you're also protected by your social institutions. They screen out a lot of potential complexity as well, as long as they're functional. And also, I think, as long as they follow some of the Piagetian rules. And so one of the Piagetian rules for a playable game is there's some reciprocity. You know, you regard the system, roughly speaking, as either fair or fairer than any other system you can think up. You know, it boils down to the same thing, because if it's not fair but you can't come up with a better fantasy, well, it's as good as it can be. So the sociological or sociopolitical structures that keep complexity away from us can only operate under a certain limited number of constraints, but still they perform their function, you know, and very admirably. It's amazing, I think, because I see people in my clinical practice all the time, you know, and most people that I see, and I think this is true of most people in the world, have at least one serious problem. You know, and it might be they have an illness that's just god-awful, or if they don't have an illness, one of their immediate family has an illness that's god-awful, or they're really old and they need to be taken care of, or they're suffering from some insane economic problem, or they've just been unemployed, or whatever. You know, there's something in their immediate circle that's really, really difficult to grapple with, and yet people still go out and maintain their place in the world, and the whole thing roughly works. And to me, that's just a continual source of amazement that people can pull that off, you know.